Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dar.
My guest today is John McWhorter, who's a professor at Columbia University and author of a new book called Wokeism. There's been a lot of emotional debate in the last few years about quote-unquote systemic racism in America. I say debate because many people disagree about the existence or extent of systemic racism and argue that our laws and system are designed to be colorblind, and that any lingering racism has actually been declining for decades. And that the lingering racism is not so much due to the system or laws as the failure to apply them. In other words, the system isn't racist anymore, but some people are. To which mafia boss James Gandolfini of The Sopranos would say, "What you gonna do?" John's new book is a call for us to understand that people of a certain ideology are attempting to transform this country on the basis of racism. John refers to the new ideology as quote-unquote third-wave anti-racism. What struck me in reading his book is that he describes this movement as a new religion, not like a religion, but an actual religion. And while the religion may be well-intentioned, John's view is that it does more harm than good to Black people and to America in general. In today's conversation, we dig deeper into the nature and timing of this third-wave anti-racism. We discuss the role of technology and norms in shaping it, its impacts on America, and considerations for lawmakers and leaders for how to think about policies to create a fairer world of equal opportunity for everyone, where we look ahead more than behind. John, welcome to Brave New World. I am delighted to have you on the show.
Thank you, Vasant. Good to be here.
So I usually start by asking my guests to just share something personal about themselves. So why don't we just start with anything you want to say?
I'm not sure what I would say there, but I think there are a lot of people who think that what I wake up thinking about is contrarian things about race. But the truth is that I am a linguist by training and not a linguist who specializes in race issues within linguistics. I'm really just kind of a nerd. But I have a calling, which is to express my views on race issues as well. And it's beginning to take up more time than it probably should. And I have a lot of hobbies, but I think there's some people who think that all I do is, talk about reparations and affirmative action. That is definitely not the case.
Well, race is certainly front and center these days, isn't it? But the degree of groundswell in this area surprises me more than a little. In my lifetime, I've seen an unbelievable degree of improvement in race relations and social norms on the streets and in the workplace. People used to say a lot of nasty and insensitive stuff to your face a few decades ago, whereas now feels like a charm in comparison. So how do we get here?
Well, it's a sad situation that we're in, and it's been brewing for a long time. And how we got here is that once racism on a person-to-person level receded really starkly in this country, and once even what's often called institutional racism was no longer as stark or as impregnable as it used to be, then there emerged this new sense of self among a lot of Black people, which is basically what you could call a noble victim complex. And that's not just about being Black. That's a personality type. You can find it in the rainforest. It's, there are certain kinds of human beings who have an identity that's based around being the victim of things other people are doing wrong. And a lot of what other people are doing wrong, for you to be somebody whose personality is based on this, it has to be fictionalized. You have to be making it up. It's just part of your personality. Black America is encouraged to OD on that. And way of being white has emerged where the way that you show that you're a good person is to show that you're not a racist. And it's become, as I've often put it over the past several years, a kind of religion where instead of displaying your faith, you're displaying your non-racism. And that's felt to be the heart of what it is to be a good person, especially if you're not a devout member of any other kind of religion. So white people and Black people do this kind of dance. And that's been going on for a long time, but it really did jump the rails in the summer of 2020 in a brand new way.
So let's pick up on something which you said in your book, Wokeism. You said that this third wave anti-racism is not like a religion, it is a religion. Mm-hmm. So just put that in context here. What was the first wave, the second wave, and why do you call this a religion as opposed to it's not like a religion, it is a religion in sort of the anthropological sense of the word?
Very, very much so. I really think that we have seen a religion form. And just as with, for example, Christianity in Europe in medieval times, those people didn't think of themselves as quote unquote religious. They thought that they were dealing with truth, and the people who didn't believe in those things were on the sidelines and didn't get to say much. And so the people today don't think of themselves as having a religion, but part of many religions is things that do not follow the basic lines of logic. There's an extent to which you have to suspend your disbelief and adhere to certain basic tenets regardless of the logic. And that has become the case with this, I call these people the elect religion. And so you get contradictions such as that in a poor black community, a black guy might be killed by a cop. It happens very occasionally. In that same community, a black guy often has a good chance of being killed by another black guy, a much, much bigger chance than being killed by a cop. Yet, under our racial agreement in this country, we're supposed to decry the cop killings and kind of downplay that the people who very occasionally get killed by a cop are constantly killing one another. You aren't supposed to talk about that, and that makes, and it sounds so heartless within the reality of these things, but you're not supposed to ask that question. It's not that you get an answer to it, it's that you're not supposed to ask. That's religious. That's rather similar to the fact that you're supposed to accept that God does terrible things and allows horrible things to happen. And that doesn't really make sense, or if it does, nobody ever gives you a case that feels exactly watertight, but you just have to let it go. There are all sorts of things about the way we're encouraged to think about race that really don't make any sense in the logical sense, but you accept them because there's this fundamental commitment to showing that you know racism exists. And as long as you've done that, you've done your job, and you're not supposed to really do much of anything else. And so what you have is it's a religion, although it'll be probably centuries before everybody will agree that that's what emerged.
So I want to come back to why now, and I want to ask whether this is a generational thing. One of my previous guests on the show, my colleague Jonathan Haidt, who's written this book called The Coddling of the American Mind, where he talks about a new phenomena on campuses, which he describes a lot more eloquently than I'll be able to, and I'll refer people to it. But the gist of it is that there's this new kind of thinking, and I guess it's, I can't put it any better. It's coddling, that if something is wrong, you complain as opposed to sort of get on with it and sort of take charge of the situation, deal with life and the fact that, it throws curveballs at you. We've had a brutal history, humanity has. It's just sort of the way things have been. And so when I was growing up, it was like, stop complaining, make the best of the situation. Now, I don't want to be insensitive to the brutal history that, this country has had. And Randall Robinson describes it very eloquently in his book called The Debt. But is this a generational thing? And is it related to what Jonathan Haidt is talking about? That this is a Gen XYZ, whatever you want to pick, phenomenon?
I think that there's a larger picture. The Coddling of the American Mind is a wonderful book, and I do recommend it to all. But those basic tenets that they see, a lot of this really jumped the rails on college campuses starting in the early teens. And the reason that happened, some people say it's because of helicopter parenting. I think more important was just social media, carrying the whole world with you in your phone, and how easy it became for like-minded people to communicate and even dominate. It starts really with Twitter becoming default in 2009. Let that go for a few years and you have a generation who have come of age with social media. And so there was a new mood on campus starting in about 2014, and that's what Jonathan and Greg Lukianoff were referring to. Then in 2020, what happened last year was that way of looking at things spread from college campuses into the general polity in a new way. And it's not an accident that two of those tenets are what hurts you makes you weaker, doesn't make you stronger. And the world is divided between good and bad people. Those are the sorts of things that allow you to do this kind of suspension of disbelief that I'm talking about. The idea is that here are these three tenets that no parent would ever teach their child that go directly against what's thought of as cognitive normality. And yet they're readily accepted, if not openly spoken, by first college culture and then American leftist culture as a whole. It makes no logical sense except as the tenets of a religion devoted to victimhood. And so you have a very interesting development that makes more sense than it can seem.
If you consider Robinson's The Debt again, which was written in 2000, and compare that to Ta-Nehisi Coates' 15, 16 years later, where social media was in full-fledged form, would The Debt have had a similar reaction if it had come out in 2015 or 2016?
Yeah, that's an interesting hypothetical, because if you were the age that I am, I'm in my mid-50s, it means that you were a fully mature adult when The Debt came out. And it's now 20 years ago. It's easy to be interested in race and to have not even been born then. But The Debt was a phenomenon. Any racially conscious person read it and probably actually read it cover to cover. Now you'd never know it existed. But it's interesting. Ta-Nehisi Coates' article is why I'm talking to you in a way, because it was then that I realized that something different was going on. Because I thought, okay, here it is, 2014, and he's writing about reparations in one article in The Atlantic, and I thought, The Debt was 10 minutes ago. Not 10 minutes, but it had only been about 15 years before, and everybody was just shouting about this article as if he was making some new point. And I'm not putting down the article, but I thought of it as, reparations again. But for a lot of people, they really thought of it as something kind of scriptural. And I realized to myself, people are not responding to this because the argument is new. They're responding to this because they're thinking of it as scripture. It's as if this is something from the Bible. They like reading this again when it's well stated. And so, if Robinson had come up with The Debt, just say maybe 10 years later, maybe 15 years later, it would be treated as one of the testaments of the Bible too. But as it is, I'm not sure what he has withdrawn to. You stopped hearing from him after about 2006 or 7. But it's as if that book didn't exist. And that's only because there was no social media then. Ta-Nehisi Coates' article got around because there was Twitter and Facebook. Yeah.
Yeah, I certainly had not heard of that book, and I only became aware of it reading your book, and it was fascinating. I agree. I think it's a must read. It's really sort of hard hitting. I also saw what Ta-Nehisi Coates said about the firefighters and cops who died during 9/11, which I thought was, I guess to put it mildly, incredibly insensitive. Do people just ignore it because he's sort of one of the high priests of this new religion, and that it's just the weight of it just allows him to say something like that? Because I can't imagine a public figure really saying something like that and not being excoriated for something like that.
Yeah, that passage in his book, and that's typical of the tone, but that particular passage, that's an example of what I mean by the religion, because for him to be allowed to get by with something that insensitive, he's talking about kids who never saw their father come home again, and Ta-Nehisi Coates is a father himself. And yet he writes that, and he's given a pass. It's because this religion is all about showing that you know that racism exists. Either if you're black, that you've suffered it and you know that it exists. If you're white, that you know that it exists and that maybe you even are part of the problem. That's the basic idea. So when you're talking about the 9/11 firefighters and police officers in that way, you are railing your fists against racism. And if that's what he's doing, he's allowed to say something that utterly unfeeling because he's a black man saying it about what were mostly white people. And he's considered a kind of high priest. And so he can say what he wants, even that. But the problem is, and here is more of the going against logic, it also infantilizes him to allow that he can say something like that and nobody's going to call him on it. It means that people think of him as a lesser being in some ways. He's not subject to censure because maybe he won't understand it or the like. He's being treated as a child. He won't perceive that, but you can stand from the outside and see it. And it's a dirty shame. And part of my book is trying to get at things like that because they need to be called out.
So, considering the brutal history of the world and the US when it comes to race, I can certainly understand the sensitivity around fairness and applying the law equally. But I'll come back to the question I started with, namely, why all this attention now? And is it doing more harm than good in the longer term by focusing on victimhood instead of creating aspiring individuals who are more aware of the opportunities that exist now? Someone called this social currency, which I interpret to mean the savvy about how the world works and how to exploit the opportunities in a society.
Well, I really do worry about the impact on black people because black people are routinely underestimated by this ideology. And a lot of the theme is by implication to deprive black people of genuine challenge. If black people aren't good at standardized tests for historically conditioned reasons, withdraw the test. Don't teach black people to be better at the test. Just pull the test away. If black people are not getting into the very tippy top schools because of problems like those, change the standards. Have a lower standard of admission for black students. Overpraise black people for things that you wouldn't praise white people for. All of that just runs throughout. It deprives black people of understanding what it is to really rise to a challenge. It deprives black people of the incentive to do their very, very best. I can certainly say that I knew about racial preferences when I was a kid, and I knew therefore, I don't have to try as hard. Now, because I'm such a nerd, that meant trying so hard that there were things that were available to me. But that could not, I don't have documentation, but that could not be the case with an awful lot of black kids. You learn that you're considered so interesting just because of your color that you don't have to push as hard as, say, the Jewish kid at the desk next to you. And then in general, there is the whole idea that you've done your job by showing that you know racism exists. But this means that all of this energy is put into things like, quote unquote, defunding the police. And I understand that in itself. But what about the same energy going into keeping black men from killing one another in big cities in the hundreds every summer? That's not considered as important a problem. That means that black people are being killed in greater numbers than they probably would be, because it's more fun to complain about the latest white cop who made a mistake than to allow that people in black communities might sometimes deserve censure themselves, because black people, like all people, are human beings. So yeah, it's harmful because it treats black people as children. That's why I wrote the book, too. The book is not me being a Fox News person and complaining about a bunch of people going crazy and rioting in their neighborhoods. I'm saying that the ideology that mostly white people have, and they're enabling in the black community, is anti-black, and they don't even seem to know it.
So they're out of good intentions actually doing harm that they don't realize.
They very much are in many, many ways. Yeah.
So, I want to come back to this thing you said about standards and teaching in an anti-racist way, because I heard a discussion between you and Dan Lowry about anti-racist math, if I remember correctly. Can you just sketch that out for us, like what that really boils down to? What does that mean?
Well, there is a fringe idea that over the past, predictably, year and a half is not being treated as fringe, which is that it's racist to expect black kids to get the specific answer. It's racist to expect black kids to raise their hand before they talk. It's racist to expect black kids to reason through math problems that are purely abstract as opposed to situating these problems in the real world. But the most alarming aspect is the idea that to expect black kids to do algebra or trigonometry and actually get the answer, as opposed to maybe making a stab, circling around it, is too much to expect. And the idea is that black kids, especially poor black kids, tend not to be good at things like that, just like poor white kids aren't. So if it seems to be a challenge for such kids, then you're supposed to withdraw the challenge. So there's such thing as black math, and the black math is all about approximating. The black math is all about situating the math in the realities of the society that the kids live in. But frankly, once you get into the abstractions of, say, trigonometry and calculus, that gets hard. There's an extent to which you just have to sit there and deal with those dry numbers on the page. Well, that's racist now. And there's another corollary to this, which is that white people are too uptight, too interested in precision, too linear, too interested in getting from point A to point B, that these are negative qualities. These are unhuman, these are sterile qualities, and that we need to look to black people because we black people are more in touch with the human essence. Now, a lot of this, say 10 years ago, was woo-woo stuff that certain people tossed around. Stereotypically, people write me that it tends to be a certain kind of white woman. I don't quite intuit that, but it's not an influential school of thought. But suddenly last year, it started being taken more seriously by a few states. And I think it fits into our general ideology, which is that it's racist to submit black people to challenge. And one of those challenges being to reason abstractly and to work with precision. That won't do, because it just means that you are denying black people the ability to join modern society in these sorts of post-Enlightenment developments. It just won't stand, and somebody needs to speak against it who isn't white themselves.
I'm actually a little baffled by this personally, because I don't see how precision is associated with any kind of culture. And, this reminds me of one of my favorite activities in New York City is jazz at Lincoln Center. And I listen to Wynton Marsalis and his orchestra. And I mean, that's about as precise as you get in terms of, an exhibition of music and music theory. So I'm just baffled that anyone can really take that kind of thing seriously.
Well, most people don't realize the precision that jazz involves, I think. And so you watch Wynton Marsalis and you see him improvising over the chords. And so that looks intuitive, that looks improvisatory, that looks spiritual. They don't know that he has to be able to do that in any number of keys, how hard it is to play the trumpet, etc. So I think people think jazz is easier than, say, Mozart or Mahler. They don't think of the jazz saxophonist as being precise. You have to know a little music theory to fully get that. And so, the idea is that, Africans may be many things, but Africans aren't exact. And we need to go back to that. The technology that we're using would not have been invented if we went with that kind of thinking. But here we are.
Wow, that's interesting. So let's talk about the position of universities in all of this. It's a very sensitive issue, and I can see in my own institution a heightened sensitivity towards accommodation. I'm sure yours is the same. In fact, the president of Princeton said his university was racist, quote, sometimes by conscious intention, but more often through unexamined assumptions and stereotypes, ignorance or sensitivity, and the systemic legacy of past decisions and policies, unquote. Several Princeton faculty were quite upset and disagreed with their president. Again, I'm sure there's a lot of truth to what the president's saying, but again, I'd say that 50 years ago, racism was often intentional and overt relative to now, where we've become proper to a fault. So what's going on here? Are we supposed to teach differently going forward?
Well, part of it is that critical race theory is at the heart of a lot of this. And critical race theory is something invented by legal scholars, and their ideas were based partly on the deconstructionist orientation of literary studies. The idea that everything in society should be focused on power differentials is an intellectual one. It's not something that would occur to somebody who isn't thinking really hard about society with the camera pulled way back. That's an intellectual's conceit. And so it starts there. And yet Princeton has gotten to the point that I would not step foot on that campus. I mean, of all of the Ivies, that's the one where it really does seem to be another planet. Unless you realize it's church. It's literally church. Ice Gruber is not the chancellor of a university. He is a monsignor. He's a high priest. And only in that sense does that manifesto that all of those professors signed make any sense. Only under that analysis does it make sense how they've treated people who dissented from the doctrine, even politely. It's church. Princeton is like walking into the 1500s in Europe at this point. But yet it starts because to think that all intellectual, aesthetic, and moral endeavor be focused on power differentials is a very noble but very strange and extremely analytical perspective on this multifaceted thing that we call life. Only somebody with a PhD could come up with that. But the problem is where it goes when it trickles down into the society that we actually live in and is misused by people who are religious zealots rather than the political reformers that they think of themselves as being.
So just a quick clarification here, John. So this critical race theory, and I am expressing my ignorance here, has it grown out of the critical theory of the 80s now with race thrown in? Is that
Exactly.
a reasonable summary of it?
Yeah, critical theory is how it starts, and then there's a racial aspect to it, which dominates a lot of thought now, and not precisely in the way that the legal theorists expressed it, but in the basic underpinnings. But yes, this starts as critical theory that anybody who was around in the 80s and hung out at universities got a dose of. And you always thought, yes, that does express a certain truth. That's an analysis that is worth being at the table, but you never thought that you were going to have whole schools devoting themselves to that particular perspective and with anger. That's not what anybody would have expected in 1986, and here we are.
Right. In one sense, I can see why universities would take up this charge of trying to of accommodating other views, including looking at things through the lens of power dynamics. But this is filtered all the way down to like primary schools. My kids went to Grace Church School close to NYU. And Grace Church School has been really embroiled in, I don't even know what to call it. Controversy is a mild term for it. But there have been a lot of reactions to, I guess, telling teachers what to do and how to teach and all of that. A lot of pushback. How is it filtered down to that level? How do kids who are, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old process critical race theory when they're still trying to read and write and learn arithmetic?
Well, the idea is to teach these kids how to be radical left infused people, because the people who are teaching them these things think of this as truth, not just as one opinion. They think of it as overarching truth. And the idea is to get them while they're young, before they really know how to question, so that it's a formative experience. And I think that the people who are bringing this to children really see themselves as helping to change the world. I have encountered people like this for a while. Educational schools of education have always been ripe for this kind of ideology, because they've really, since the late 60s, been interested more in teaching people to teach students to be leftist than in teaching them how to actually instruct kids. It's really a scandal. But it makes a certain sense that if you think that you're changing the world the way it needs to be changed, overturning these power differentials, then why not get people while they're young? And nobody is teaching the foundational papers of critical race theory to 10-year-olds. It's ways of teaching that are infused by that way of thinking, with the idea being that these kids are supposed to have as their main meal a constant questioning of differentials of power, especially the ones that are fashioned by race. If I were one of these people, I would want there to be Sunday school. That's exactly what this is. Get them while they're young. But we've got to realize that's what it is. Before, you really do have young kids having an education of that rather than an actual education. Schools were bad enough as it was. But yeah, Grace Church is a good example.
In one sense, I'm always sympathetic to discussions about race and power. And, there's probably some benefits to be derived from an open discussion of these issues. What do you see as the risks associated with this? I guess what some people would perceive as a somewhat heavy-handed approach at the primary school level and then at universities. What are the risks of this? How is this going to play out?
It encourages incuriosity is what worries me about it, because if you're teaching from these basic tenets, no one is allowed to question them except maybe if they are not clear on something, or you learn to ask questions that show that you know what racism is, etc. But you're not really allowed to think over anything. Instead, your thought patterns are channeled into an eternal quest to find power differentials being abused. And you'll always find it. But the thing is, that's one of a great many things that this thing called life entails. And so next thing you know, you are less of a thinker than you would have been. And it's particularly sad to see what this does to academia, where you have a certain kind of academic, and unfortunately they are now not rare, where they're only equipped to ask a certain kind of question, have no genuine interest in anything beyond this issue of power differentials, although they might not call it that. And the field suffers because certain questions aren't asked, certain things don't get support, certain ideas that are only half-baked get oversold and get paid too much attention. It really is a shame. And I've seen this for a while. It's not that 2020 absolutely turned the world upside down. There there's a sociologically concerned aspect of linguistics. There's a subfield of linguistics called sociolinguistics. And long before I had the vocabulary to explain these things or to quite conceive of them, I noticed that in sociolinguistics, as it was in the late 80s and early 90s when I was introduced to it, certain questions were asked much more than others. And way back then, I thought this is supposed to be about language in the social sphere, but what it's really about is language as used by people who are forming their identities against the white hegemony. And that's interesting in itself, but I thought there's so much else that a sociolinguistics could study that people seem less interested in here. That was going on even back then, but we've really seen this sort of thing focused all over academia, especially over the past couple of years.
When I look at this landscape and I see this new religion, and let's say it's, for lack of a better term, ultra-left, although that's not really doing it justice because it's, as you say, sort of more religious in nature, versus, let's say, the ultra-right, which is kind of scary. I mean, which of these poses a greater risk to America at the moment?
Well, it depends on what America you're looking at, but the truth is that you hit loony left and the loony right. The loony left are penetrating more institutions. And so I think that a particularly vivid image that we have now is the right-wing equivalents of these people storming the Capitol. And that was a horrible thing. But how often has something like that happened? And more to the point, storming a building, having an ugly march where things turn really ugly, those things happen with the loony right. But they're not changing anything except, in groups online. There are no institutions that are basically dancing to their tune, as opposed to the left where, academia, the arts, corporate procedure, so many things are changing on the basis of fealty to this religion that's all about a studied demonstration that you are not a racist. And so I find this more frightening than the racist right-winger who is equally impervious to logic, equally impervious to asking real questions. It's the same kind of personality. It's just the politics that are different. But yeah, I'm more afraid with the left at this point. And the left tend to be more articulate. And all those big words and all of that, clever sarcasm, that stuff makes them seem righter than they are. We need to have a new kind of conversation.
It's interesting. I hadn't actually thought of it this way before I read your book, which is that the left is having much more of an impact, a visible impact on institutions, whereas the right-wing thing seems like a bunch of nutcases. Right? It reminds me of the looting that happened in New York City versus this kind of looting. It wasn't really looting, but storming the Capitol, where some might even pardon the looting as being arising out of deep-seated feelings of, that the deck is stacked against people, so that exactly looting is justified. And this is something you actually talk about in your book as well. One of the things that I wondered about when I read your book is what we're seeing playing out at the moment. Is this the equivalent of reparations?
It's interesting. Part of this is a renewed call for reparations, but a lot of the things that have happened are very much in the spirit of reparations, especially if you get away from the idea of reparations being about payments to individual Black people. And what I find poignant is that so much has gone on that you could call reparations, with white people bending over backwards to do the right thing and sometimes even doing it. And yet, because we're dealing with a religion where the basic underpinnings have to stay the way they are because it's how you get your sense of being a worthy person, nobody will be able to admit that the changes have meant anything or mean anything good. So all of these, gestures that corporations are making, all of these special funds, all of these things that are being made free, all of these incredible capitulations to a movement that's basically saying Black America is mired in the same situation it was in 50 years ago, except, the deck chairs have been rearranged on the Titanic. So much has happened, especially since 2 summers ago. And yet nobody will be able to admit it. The sorts of people who depict America as a racist hellhole are saying the same things now that they were saying a year and a half ago, and they will be a year and a half from now. So yeah, all these things could be seen as at least the beginning of reparations, but nobody will allow us to call them those.
Where is all this going? And this reminds me of, in my field, people talk about don't confuse correlation for causation. And a lot of the arguments I'm seeing for, let's say, inequality, inequity, lack of opportunity, it's assumed that it's racism that's actually causing it. There could be lots of other reasons that could be causing it, more structural reasons, parents, the education level of parents, the nutrition, where you grow up, all kinds of other things that happen to be correlated with race, but are the real sort of structural drivers of inequality, lack of equal opportunity, etc. Is that what's really going on here, that we're mistaking sort of correlation for causation and just pointing everything at race and racializing every inequity or inequality we see out there?
Yes, that is very much the case. And there is a such thing as somebody who is suffering because of a chain series of things that are due to what color they are. Systems that were set in place against black people 50 or 100 years ago, where the effects of that remain, even if no racist is left who actually set the system up and nobody involved in the system is actively being a racist. That can exist. But the problem is we look at these things with a willful kind of simplicity that implies that there's always a direct correlation between some inequity and racist discrimination of some kind. And where it gets hard to attribute it to anything going on in the present, you call it institutional and you say it's just in the air. But people are alarmingly imprecise about exactly what that means. And the truth is that as time goes by, a culture may develop problems where the connection to racism, if there is one, is so abstract that it's not really worth talking about. And so one example that I use is that black teens will often tell another black teen who does well in school that he's acting white. And the reasons for that start when black teens are in the 60s in desegregated schools, and the openly racist white kids that were in those schools at that time were mean to them, and so were the teachers, and so it felt like school was the white man's game. People start being called white for liking school, roughly in 1966. But then it takes its place as a kind of meme, where it's not that there's that kind of racism in the schools anymore, and what racism there is in the schools would never create this complete disidentification from school. What it is that it takes its place as one of many ways that teens can feel like they're part of a little group. If you're white, there are various things you can do. If you're black, one thing open to you is to think that being a good student makes you white, or that being a bad student is authentically black, which is another thing that a lot of those kids often think. And so it means that, is it racism that makes kids today say, who do you think you are, white, for liking school? No. It's racism 50 and 60 years ago that sparked it, but you can't do anything about that. Today, you have to take the kids aside and say, no, there is nothing un-black about doing well in school. You can't say, Seth, stop being racist against Malcolm so that he won't disidentify from school, because Seth's dead. And so it's a very difficult situation. And yet, what I just told you is considered heresy. Any problem black people have is supposed to be due to systemic racism. That's a very simplistic way of looking at social history. But part of this religion is that we know that things are complex in general. But when it comes to black history, everything is always supposed to be just A, B, C. Everything is just, three basic colors. It won't do. It just won't do.
John, where's the common ground here? As an immigrant who came here more than 40 years ago, one of the things I've always admired about America is its openness and remarkable ability to change for the better, to do what makes sense. When the World Trade Center came down, I couldn't imagine that a Muslim with a hijab would walk around the city, and yet 20 years later, it isn't uncommon. I cannot imagine another country on the planet where that would happen. So let's acknowledge this resilience about a society and its determination to move in the right direction through better laws and norms. So where's the common ground here as Americans, common instead of divisive, regardless of our origins?
Well, I think that really About 10 years ago, the country was coming to a kind of consensus, I felt, which was that racism exists and it must be decried, but that there are also some cultural problems in the black community, and wherever they came from, the black community needs to look inward and do something about those. There was a time, I remember a specific conversation I had in 2010, where the kind of white person who today would bend over backwards and pretend to think that racism is everything that ails black people at all and that they themselves are racist. That same person in the same suit sitting in the same, university boardroom would say, yes, racism exists, but there are also some cultural problems and it's a matter of, how you're going to address both of those things. That person is now cowed into silence. But what we really need is just three things that I think the whole country could get behind, especially since it would help poor white people too. We need to end the war on drugs because I think that has destroyed black communities much more than anything called racism. I think that we need to reform how poor kids are taught how to read because that has a lot to do with making people disidentify from school. And I think that we need to emphasize vocational education. The idea that you get an audience to applaud by saying you're going to make college available to more people. No, it should not be that we think that the real default life trajectory is that after high school, you go spend 4 years somewhere taking classes and probably living in a dorm, or even if you're a commuter student. That shouldn't be seen as the default trajectory. We need to go back a good 75 years and have a person thinking, I'm going to graduate from high school, I'm going to get trained as an electrician, and I'm going to have a nice, solid middle-class existence fixing people's lights, and that's a life. As opposed to teaching people that if they don't go to college or if they don't, pretend to go to college for 2 years at some jerkwater community college, they haven't done their job. It's silly. Do those three things and you would have a new black America, the war on drugs in particular. Our whole race conversation would change in a generation, but we have to have those things happen.
I agree that there's a lot to be said for vocational education, considering what electricians, plumbers, and masons make. I mean, I have a hard time getting an electrician to show up for 60 or 70 bucks an hour. This thing about vocational versus liberal education reminds me of the views of Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, who came up in my conversation with Michael Roth, the president of Wesleyan University. Roth quoted Du Bois as saying, quote, education should create an empowerment of the whole person, not just a sharpening of skills that create short-term value, unquote. I think universities could do more in this regard by making a solid liberal education accessible to more people, that is, giving people the capacity to do and learn more. What's your thinking on vocational and liberal education?
Well, I think that another rant of mine that I've just kind of stopped doing because we have other things to do is that I think that there should be 13 grades. This idea is not original to me, but high school should go on for about another extra year, and high school should prepare you to go out into the world and get a grown-up job. That liberal education should be something that you get in school. You shouldn't have to wait till college, and then you move on. And I think that there's too much going on to expect any movement on that anytime soon. But I think that's what needs to go on there. It's not that more people should get a liberal education on some campus with antique buildings where they pretend to like Shakespeare, etc. All of that should be much earlier. But another thing that really won't go, and I don't think the people who are really caught up in electness fully get this, the country will never truly understand the idea that a community of poor white people where every third person is addicted to meth and children are suffering and job opportunities are scarce, that those white people have privilege and therefore they deserve less of our attention than black people because we're descended from slaves. That's never going to happen. It's at the point where we really do need to go back to actually what Dr. King was thinking about, which is it's about poverty. We need to deal with poor people of all kinds. And also, middle-class black people do not need special help. The idea that people like me need help because we don't have privilege and white people don't see us as full people, etc. I think that, my problems along those lines do not deserve national attention. They should not furnish, best-selling books like White Fragility with the idea that I need whites to know that, that I'm suffering. None of that. It's about black people who need help. And it's at the point where people used to complain about racializing poverty It's a stereotype, people used to say, to imply that all black people are poor, that poverty is only a black thing. Well, now we're past that. And it's time that we dealt with the hillbilly elegy people, just like we deal with the black people that are more familiar to us from the media. And I think that help can be given. And I think that if we focus more on socioeconomics than race, we're going to have legislation that's more likely to pass, if we can slip it through the window, and we can actually see real progress.
Indeed. In fact, as you were talking, I was reminded of, I'm involved in a project in India where it's interesting how some of these less developed countries have leapfrogged the developed world in some ways because of technology. There's now a platform in India that's used by 180 million people. Like, this is primary education, right? Where textbooks from schools have QR codes, you can scan them, you can do exercises, you can do assessments, like all that kind of stuff, right? So I don't think it's necessarily the case that one needs to be on Ivy League campuses. I think, we're entering a brave new world of just all kinds of new alternatives that, I think that could be sort of beneficial to humanity at a scale that we've never seen before. So, I'm an optimist. So I just sort of see the world that way, and maybe tech is providing some of the answers that we're seeking.
I hope so.
John, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thanks for your time. In closing, what would your recommendations be to policymakers in this arena? How should lawmakers be thinking about the problems that we've been talking about?
Well, to be honest, I really think, and I have thought this for over 10 years now, that the war on drugs is the key to this. Because if it's possible to make a living, not a lush living, but if it's possible to keep the wolf from the door by selling drugs illegally instead of taking legal work, there will always be a critical mass of poor, underserved black men who do that. And when you do that, you have no future. You probably go to jail. You've probably got kids who will then grow up without a dad. And you end up creating community problems. You come back from prison. You are probably addicted to something from having been there for so long. You have no job skills. You probably go back to jail, or if you don't, your life is never really terribly dignified again. All of that is created by this war on drugs, where if you couldn't make a bit of a living selling hard drugs on the street, those men would find legal work, and they wouldn't be working in boardrooms at first, but they would do what their grandfathers did, which was better than this business of utilizing a black market to have pocket money and to live a halfway decent life. And so we're letting go of the idea that there's something horrible about marijuana. And I think that's great. But we need to go further. We need to have regulated but available legal hard drugs like cocaine and heroin, and make it so that you cannot make a living selling these things illegally on the street. That would turn poor black America upside down instantly. But we need lawmakers to have the bravery to admit that the war on drugs has been a failure, and to go back to the way things were, say, 60 years ago, which were, far, far from utopia. But you couldn't make that living. That wasn't an option. And therefore, the black community, poor though it was much more cohesive. Murder was rarer. We need to at least go back to that.
Well said, John. One last question. What do you think of Bernie Sanders' utopia of free education for everyone?
It'd be nice, as long as we understand that everybody doesn't want to go to 4 years of college. I think that the free education for everyone should include 2-year vocational schools where you don't have to go into any debt to get your training. But sure, I don't think that's going to fly, but it would be nice if we had that European system where you could get a decent education without paying any money all the way up to those levels. Sure, I would go for it.
Yeah, would be, wouldn't it? Well, John, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for joining me and sharing your thoughts with the rest of the world. And really good luck with the book. I really enjoyed reading it.
Thank you.